It's fine to have a legitimate argument about climate change. Is there a hope that modern technology will advance fast enough that we'll be able to overcome the effects of climate change and everyone will be happy? Well, there's a chance, but it's a pretty low chance if we're not putting in effort to make it happen.
This is a community-supported legal education channel. Find out how you can support our mission at the links in the description below.
The communication to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and it is brought by this list of children. We'll see them in a moment, so I'm not going to go over them individually other than to point out that, like, everybody in the US is currently aware of who Greta Thunberg is. There are a number of others. We'll look at them too. But Kaylee has been nice enough to highlight out what she thinks we should be reading, because there's 100+ pages to this. And it starts with a quote from UNICEF. There may be no greater growing threat facing the world's children and their children than climate change. The science is incontrovertible. Global warming is caused by human activities that emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere of the planet. Each day, the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, industrial processes, and agriculture adds hundreds of millions of tons to CO2 to the atmosphere, where it will remain for centuries. There is now more CO2 in the atmosphere than at any time in the past 800,000 years. The Earth is 1.1 degrees centigrade hotter than before the Industrial Revolution, and it is approaching a tipping point of foreseeable and irreversible catastrophic effects. If the Earth reaches 2 degrees centigrade of heating, the exacerbated air pollution alone is forecast to cause 150 million deaths. If the Earth reaches 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of heating by 2100, which is the current trajectory if member states, that is, do not make drastic emissions reductions, the impacts of climate change will threaten the lives and welfare of over 2 billion children. The climate change crisis is not an abstract future threat, they say. The 1.1 degrees C rise in global average temperature is presently causing devastating heat waves, forest fires, extreme weather patterns, floods, and sea level rise, infringing on the human rights of millions of people globally. Because children are among the most vulnerable to these life-threatening impacts physiologically and mentally, they will bear the burden of these harms far more and far longer than adults. Petitioners, children from around the world, already carry that burden. Climate change is exposing them to life-threatening dangers and harming their health and development. For the indigenous petitioners, their 1,000-years-old cultures are threatened by climate change. Hotter temperatures foster the spread of infectious diseases and exacerbate health hazards. Wildfires are growing more frequent and intense because of hotter and drier conditions. Heat waves and drought are threatening children's lives and creating water scarcity. Extreme storms that were once rare are now regular events. Floods and rising sea levels are transforming children's relationships with the land. The subsistence way of life of many indigenous communities is at stake. Climate change has affected children's mental health around the world. As the American Psychological Association has observed, psychologists now grapple with new 21st century disorders, including climate anxiety and solastalgia, mourning the destruction of a cherished place. These harmful impacts are the result of just 1 degree C of global warming. As heating accelerates, unabated climate change will expose the petitioners to further deadly and foreseeable consequences for the rest of their lives. The extent of the harm depends on the extent of the warming. Every day of delay depletes the remaining carbon budget, the amount of carbon that can still be emitted before the climate reaches unstoppable and irreversible ecological and human health tipping points. The respondents are creating an imminent risk. It will be impossible to make up for lost mitigation opportunities and impossible to ensure the sustainable and safe livelihood of future generations. If it feels like, why do we have to say this? It's because we have to say this. This is a threat and it's not being taken seriously. The climate change crisis is a children's rights crisis. Children have an inalienable right to life under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the convention. The convention, the most widely ratified human rights instrument in the world, obligates nations to respect, protect, and fulfill children's inalienable right to life, from which all other rights flow. Mitigating climate change is a human rights imperative. In the context of the climate crisis, obligations under international human rights law are informed by the rules and principles of international environmental law. The CRC must be interpreted taking into account the respondent's obligations under international environmental law. Each respondent has failed to uphold its obligations under the convention to 1. Prevent foreseeable domestic and extraterritorial human rights violations resulting from climate change. So this is getting into what the accusations are a bit. 2. Cooperating internationally in the face of the global climate emergency. So failing at that, failing to apply the precautionary principle to protect life in the face of uncertainty, and 4, failing to ensure intergenerational justice for children and posterity. The respondents are Argentina, Brazil, France, Germany, and Turkey. That means that those are the countries that are being sued under this convention, basically. They have known about the harmful effects of their internal and cross-border contributions to climate change for decades. In 1992, each signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Climate Change Convention, or CCC, and undertook to protect children from the foreseeable threats of climate change. And that was their fatal mistake, is they're the ones that signed on, so they're the ones that got sued. I'm assuming that if the United States had signed on, it would have gotten sued. And so was it a good idea that it didn't sign on, or should it be effectively joining in anyway because climate change affects us all, et cetera, et cetera? Great externalizing of corporate profits, in a sense. They haven't consented to jurisdiction, which means a sovereign nation cannot be sued. Here, even though there's still question about what exactly enforcement can, who's going to enforce this? Like, let's say that these plaintiffs win, what a court can order something, and then what? These are still sovereign nations, and they're not going to go to war with one another over their, avoiding of climate change responsibilities. Am I reading this wrong? But let's continue and just keep that in the back of your mind. It was even clearer that their emissions were endangering children's lives in 2016 when each signed the Paris Agreement, the Climate Change Convention, 97 Kyoto Protocol, and 2016 Paris Agreement were important steps in securing recognition from all member states that the climate change crisis is a common concern of mankind. But none of these efforts have reduced carbon emissions enough to avert further disaster and widespread human rights violations. Every nation has contributed to climate change. For decades, the excuse that no harm can be traced to any particular emission or country, and thus no state bears individual responsibility, has led to inaction. But under human rights law, states are individually responsible for, and should be held accountable for, their sovereign actions and inactions that cause and contribute to climate change, and thereby breach their fundamental human rights obligations. As major historical emitters and influential members of the Group of 20, the G20, a forum of the world's 20 leading economies, the respondents must lead by example, reducing emissions at the greatest possible rate and consistent with a scale that is scientifically established to protect life. Moreover, emissions from other G20 members, and in particular the major emitters, China, the US, the EU, and India, must also be curbed to ensure children's rights. Therefore, the respondents must also use all available legal, diplomatic, and economic tools to ensure that the major emitters are also decarbonizing at a rate and scale necessary to achieve the collective goals. So maybe they're using this as a vehicle to get to other major emitters like the US, EU, China, and India. Not one of the respondents is on an emissions pathway that is consistent with keeping heating under 3 degrees Celsius, much less under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Each respondent has set inadequate emission reduction targets in its Paris Agreement pledges and then failed to meet those inadequate goals. Second, as members of the G20, which makes up 84% of all global emissions, each respondent has failed to use all available legal, diplomatic, and economic means to protect children from the life-endangering carbon pollution of the major emitters, China, the EU, US, and India, and other G20 members. The convention enshrines children's rights as universal, All governments have a responsibility to take all available measures to ensure these rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. The right to life, the respondents' acts and omissions perpetuating the climate change crisis have already exposed the petitioners throughout their childhood to the foreseeable, life-threatening risks of human-caused climate change, be it heat, floods, storms, droughts, disease, or polluted air. A scientific consensus shows that the life-threatening risks confronting the petitioners will increase throughout their lives as the world heats up to 1.5 C plus and beyond. They right to health. The respondents' acts and omissions perpetuating the climate crisis have already caused injuries to petitioners' mental and physical health, from asthma to emotional trauma. Right to culture. The respondents' contributions to the climate crisis have already jeopardized millennia-old subsistence practices of the indigenous petitioners from Alaska, the Marshall Islands, and the Sapmi, the cultural region inhabited by the Sami people of the Arctic region of Europe, which are not just the main source of their livelihoods, but directly relate to a specific way of being, seeing, and acting in the world that are essential to their cultural identity. Best interests of the child. By supporting climate policies that delay decarbonization, the respondents are shifting the enormous burden and costs of climate change onto children and future generations. In doing so, they have breached their duty to ensure the enjoyment of children's rights for posterity and failed to act in accordance with the principle of intergenerational equity. This petition documents the violation of the petitioner's rights under the convention, but the scope of the climate crisis should not be reduced to the harms of a small number of children. Ultimately, at stake are the rights of every child everywhere. Each of the respondents has contributed to causing the climate crisis through their past emissions. The cumulative sum of the respondents' historical emissions show that they are the major emitters, responsible for a significant share of today's concentration of global greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Each of the respondents ranks in the top 50 historical emitters since 1850 based on fossil fuel emissions. Germany ranks 5th, France 8th, Brazil 22, Argentina 29, Turkey 31st. When land use such as deforestation is factored in, Brazil surpasses France in its historical share. These emissions continue to grow. The respondents are currently emitting at levels they know with scientific certainty are damaging the climate, harming children's health, and jeopardizing their lives. In short, each respondent has contributed to the degradation of the climate that is directly harming the petitioners and threatening their lives. So they request for relief, no compensation. No amount of money could compensate for the harm children are and will be suffering from climate change both now and the future. Instead, the petitioners respectfully request that the Committee on the Rights of the Child adopt the following recommendations for precautionary, declaratory, and remedial relief. Find that climate change is causing a children's rights crisis. Find that each respondent, along with other states, has caused and is perpetuating the climate crisis by knowingly acting in disregard of available scientific evidence regarding the measures needed to prevent and mitigate climate change. Find that by recklessly perpetuating life-threatening climate change, each respondent is violating the petitioner's rights to life, health, and the prioritization of children's best interests, as well as the cultural rights of the petitioners from indigenous communities. That the respondents review and, where necessary, amend their laws and policies to ensure that mitigation and adaptation efforts are being accelerated to the maximum extent of available resources and on the basis of the best available scientific evidence to, 1, protect petitioners' rights, the best interests of a child, particularly in allocating the costs and burdens of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Recommend that each respondent initiate cooperative international action. Recommend that pursuant to Article 12, the respondents ensure that the child's right to be heard and express their views freely in all efforts to mitigate or adapt to the climate change crisis in all efforts taken in response to this communication. So to make sure that children can participate in the process. These are your petitioners. Chiara Sacchi from Argentina. I'm gonna butcher the names. I'm sorry. Catarina Lorenzo from Brazil. Iris Duquesne from France. Reina Ivanova from Germany. Ridima Pandey from India. David Ackley III from the Marshall Islands, Rantan Anjane from the Marshall Islands, and Litokni Kabua from the Marshall Islands, Deborah Morayo Adegbile, I don't know, from Nigeria, Carlos Manuel from Palau, Ayaka Melitafa from South Africa, Greta Thunberg from Sweden, Ellen Ann from Sweden, Roslyn Jbeli, I don't know how to pronounce that, from Tunisia, Alexandria Villaseñor, I assume it's pronounced if it's Spanish pronunciation, and Carl Smith from the USA, both from the USA there. And this is a Hausfeld climate change lawsuit. Hausfeld is a law firm that has previously filed these kinds of actions. Let's see, they have one or two pictures. Pictures are worth 1,000 words here. So they have one or two pictures. They're talking about by the year 2100, we'll have a Earth that is colored red with the heat of the 3.5 degrees C rise that's predicted. No, I'm sure it's just a dramatic colorization. Even though the number is low, it seems like 3.5 degrees C. It'll be nice. It won't be so cold in winter. That's not quite how that works. It means that there's more energy in the system, but it doesn't mean that the energy is uniformly being spread around. Everybody's just going to rise by 3.5 degrees C, and that's it. That's not the end of it. That's not where it stops. So I have a couple concerns. So yes, I agree with the children. Yes, this is a crisis. It needs to be addressed. People aren't addressing it because it costs money, and people suck at spending money on external things that don't directly affect them yet. We're very, very short-sighted, our human culture, especially Western culture, extremely, extremely short-sighted and profit-driven. And think of how living paycheck to paycheck affects people. They're in survival mode. They're not in long-term planning mode. And yes, I realize that what the climate change lawsuit is about is that if you want to survive, you need to address the climate change crisis. But it's longer term. It's 50 years away, and it feels like there's nothing we can do about it. Plus, you've got all these enablers. You've got a whole bunch of other people, especially people in powerful positions, who are also kicking the can down the road or trying to deny climate change, etc. I really just can't wrap my head around how someone can read all the giant scientific consensus and just dismiss that as, this must be some kind of conspiracy. It's not like some people won't adapt to the climate change that's already happening. Some of us can afford to buy air conditioning, whatever. And in a way that creates a little bit of an economy for those countries that can afford that. You'll get more air conditioners installed and people to support the various construction for adapting to and making things robust against climate change, but it doesn't protect the people who can't afford to do that. Indigenous populations that don't necessarily, their economy isn't based on how much of something can you produce and ship into the world, trade system. I don't agree that that's the value of human life, is how much money you can make for the world economy. That needs to not be the value of human life. If we value not subjecting these people, including ourselves, but especially including vulnerable people already vulnerable to climate change will be the first affected, and those of us who can sit in our castles. It's fine to have a legitimate argument about climate change. Is there a hope that modern technology will advance fast enough that we'll be able to overcome the effects of climate change and everyone will be happy? Well, there's a chance, but it's a pretty low chance if we're not putting in effort to make it happen. And that's part of the problem. There's not been a whole lot of incentive for major industry to stop polluting, because that the polluting acts as an externalizer of the costs, making that industry stronger internally. And a country that has strong industry probably has a strong economy and has incentives to act in its own protection. So now if everybody on the world stage acts in a self-protective manner, self-protective in the short term, everybody kicks the can down the road with climate change, then it's just a later generation of people of the world who end up having to deal with the consequences. I don't see that we're doing enough. I see change. Change is good. I see lots of windmills in Scotland, lots of windmills in Europe, but there's also still tremendous polluters that seem to offset all the renewable energy, and they don't necessarily seem to be very concerned about polluting less. because that just costs money off the bottom line. The bottom line being the net profits at the end of the equation of all of your costs when you're done shipping something via a giant container ship. If you then have to pay for proper pollution controls, that probably takes a rather large chunk of your remaining profits. I don't mean we're going to be able to eliminate all pollution, but we need to reduce it to levels that can be managed. And we need to work on scrubbers or work on planting trees or work on whatever needs to be done to capture the CO2 back into an appropriate form for sustainability. It needs to be said out loud, and it's not so much that any court is going to be able to order these countries and be able to follow up on it. Like, the court might order these countries to do more, and it can issue all these orders at once, but it's not like it can then order someone to physically enforce this with threat of violence or worse. Like, really all that it can do is just proclaim, in a sense, that yes, these allegations are found to be true and that something needs to be done. It might order something specific, it might order something helpful, and it might, like Kelly says, advance the conversation in a meaningful way. Even if we're wrong about the cause, we are still right about the observations. And there's very little doubt about being wrong about the cause. There's very little scientific doubt. How there can be any doubt left that climate change is happening is beyond me. It really can only be that people are happy making a profit and they know that it's going to cost them money. So denial is easier than paying for children's futures. There has to be slow, constant pressure, constant assertive pressure to implement something to improve the world. So what do you think of that? Let us know in the comments below. All right, so that is our show, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am Leonard French, your favorite copyright attorney. Thank you for all of our supporters in the month of October. Joshua Davis has sponsored our channel for the month of October again. Also, thank you to our $50 plus supporters, Joe Tyson, Aspernari, John Steele, Gavin Barnard, Eevi, Kyle Mudrak, Michael Pearce, Spirit Bear, Jan Negrey, Daniel Perez, Snorre Wisotzky, Blackleaf, and Benjamin Hitov, or Hitov. Apologize for mispronouncing your name, Benjamin, let me know. And thank you to the $5 plus supporters that are scrolling on the LED panel behind me and will be in front of my face here on the crawl. Welcome, Brandon, who is now editing for us on a more full-time dedicated basis, so hopefully we'll be able to put out not just more videos but higher quality videos. I have a green screen to play with, so this is fun trying to bring these things to you here with then like a Leonard's cutout thing. Maybe it looks a little more professional. So things are slowly improving. So thank you for all of your support on patreon.com/ljfrench and sponsus.com/law. Without your support, this wouldn't be possible. I really appreciate it. So that's what we'll leave you with today. I will see you in the videos that drop. Love you all. Have a great weekend, great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye.